across the medbay. A human sat slumped in a sterile recliner, his skin pale, with a sheen of sweat glistening on his forehead. His injured arm was wrapped in a blood-soaked temporary dressing, exposing areas of mangled flesh and torn musculature. Vralak's 6 eyes flicked toward the med tech, a cerulean-furred Chirsk, whose expression was grim as they studied the diagnostic scans. "This is," Dire Vralak said, their mandibles clicking with rising anxiety. "The human appears critically wounded." Chirsk nodded, their hands steady but their tone firm. "The injuries are severe, Commander. The human has lost approximately 20% of his total blood volume. Immediate fluid replacement is necessary to stabilize him." "It's just a flesh wound," the human muttered through gritted teeth, his voice rasping but attempting nonchalance. His name tag, smeared with blood. Read Charlie despite the tightness in his jaw. His labored breathing betrayed him. Chirsk's eyes narrowed, their tone sharp. "This is not just anything. You're dangerously close to hypovolemic shock. Your blood pressure is already dropping, and without intervention your organs will start failing." Charlie managed a faint smirk, though his face tightened with pain. "Well, better get me patched up quick then. Can't have that." Chirsk exhaled sharply and turned to the medical console, preparing the necessary interventions. They gestured to a tray of supplies, speaking to their assistant. "Begin an intravenous line with the synthetic hemoglobin solution and saline. We'll start replenishing blood volume immediately. Set it to deliver a controlled flow. We don't want to overload his cardiovascular system." Vralak stepped closer, their mandibles twitching with concern. "Will this synthetic hemoglobin restore the human to full strength?" "It will stabilize him, but synthetic blood substitutes are temporary," Chirsk replied, their hands moving efficiently as they inserted the IV into Charlie's uninjured arm. "We're treating the symptoms of blood loss, not reversing the damage. The real healing comes later, and it's going to take time." As the fluids began to flow, Charlie winced, shifting uncomfortably in the recliner. The pale blue liquid glowed faintly as it traveled into his vein, a mix of synthetic oxygen carriers and a plasma substitute designed to mimic human blood functions. The med tech leaned in closer, scanning the wound with a handheld device. "We'll need to address the injury next," Chirsk said, carefully peeling back the temporary dressing. The sight made Vralak's sensory tendrils twist with unease. The torn muscle fibers were exposed, jagged edges of tissue fraying against the stark white of bone beneath. Charlie tensed, his knuckles white as he gripped the edges of the recliner. "You'll use that fancy bio-gel stuff, right? Heard it works miracles." "Bio-gel is a tool, not a miracle," Chirsk corrected. They reached for a sterilizing agent, spraying it over the wound. Charlie inhaled sharply but didn't cry out, though the tension in his body was unmistakable. Chirsk glanced up, noticing, "Your pain levels are spiking. I can administer an analgesic." "Don't bother," Charlie said quickly, forcing a grin. "It's not that bad." Chirsk's eyes narrowed but didn't press the issue. "Your vitals disagree. You are clearly in significant pain." "I've had worse," Charlie replied, though his voice faltered. "Just hurry it up, Doc." Chirsk sighed but complied, reaching for the bio-gel applicator. They sprayed the shimmering substance over the exposed tissue, the gel adhering instantly. It began forming a protective layer that sealed the wound from contaminants and stimulated cellular regeneration. Charlie bit down hard, his face contorting in pain. "The bio-gel will help protect against infection and promote healing," Chirsk explained clinically, "but it doesn't repair the deeper damage. Your muscles need time to regenerate naturally. Overuse of the limb during this period could result in permanent impairment." "How long are we talking?" Charlie asked, his voice tight but steady. 3 to 4 standard weeks for the musculature to fully heal, assuming no complications," Chirsk replied, inspecting the gel's adhesion. "You'll also need physical therapy to regain full strength and mobility." Charlie groaned audibly, but whether it was from the pain or the prognosis, it wasn't clear. 3 to 4 weeks? I can't sit around that long." "You won't have a choice," Chirsk said flatly, reaching for a supportive brace. They positioned Charlie's arm carefully, immobilizing it to prevent strain. "This brace will ensure you don't undo the repair. You'll need to avoid lifting or strenuous movement. Vralak, watching the procedure intently, finally spoke. And what if he defies your instructions, as humans seem prone to doing? They'll risk permanent nerve damage and scarring, Chirsk replied curtly. In short, his stubbornness will be his undoing. Charlie grimaced, though whether it was from the pain, the brace, or the implication, it was hard to say. All right, I'll behave. For now. Once the immediate stabilization was complete, Chirsk stepped back, their shoulders relaxing slightly. They placed a hand scanner over Charlie's arm, checking the biogel's integrity. This is only the first step. You'll need to come back every day for dressing changes, and in a few days we'll assess the deeper tissue repair. Physical therapy starts as soon as you're stable enough to move without exacerbating the injury. Charlie sighed, looking defeated but still managing a faint smile. Sounds like a blast. Chirsk met his gaze, their tone softening slightly. It's better than the alternative. Your body can only handle so much before even human resilience meets its limit. Charlie nodded, leaning back into the recliner with a groan. Despite his bravado, he looked exhausted, his body clearly struggling to cope. Vralak, ever observant, tilted their head. You truly intend to recover from this ordeal? Of course, Charlie muttered. You think a little setback like this is going to stop me? Vralak observed him for a moment longer, their mandibles clicking softly in thought. Humans, it seemed, had an infuriating way of downplaying their vulnerabilities, even when their bodies were falling apart. Still, there was an undeniable determination in his words, a refusal to yield that both baffled and impressed the commander. Very well, Vralak said finally, but heed the med tech's instructions, human. For once your recklessness must yield to reason. Charlie chuckled faintly, his energy fading as the sedative Chirsk had discreetly added to the fluid line began to take effect. Yeah, you win this time, Doc. As he drifted off, Chirsk turned to Vralak. He'll recover, but it won't be easy. Humans may be resilient, but even they can't rush the healing process. Vralak's sensory tendrils flicked thoughtfully. If only his mind was as disciplined as his biology. Chirsk chuckled dryly as they began preparing for the next phase of care. For all his bravado, humans were still fascinating puzzles, stubbornly refusing to fit into neat categories of logic or predictability. And yet somehow they endured. Several hours later, the medbay was quiet except for the soft hum of diagnostic machines and the faint hiss of the ventilation system. Charlie lay flat on a padded biobe, his injured arm immobilized in the supportive brace Chirsk had applied earlier. The IV line still delivered a steady infusion of synthetic hemoglobin and saline, while a nutrient drip had been added to compensate for the energy his body was burning to begin repairs. Charlie groaned softly as he stirred, blinking against the bright overhead lights. His face was pale, his forehead slick with sweat. Chirsk, reviewing a holographic diagnostic report nearby, noticed immediately and approached with their usual efficient calm. Their blue-furred hands deftly adjusted the IV flow and checked Charlie's vitals with a handheld scanner. Welcome back, Chirsk said without looking up. You're stable, but your body is under considerable strain. How do you feel? Charlie shifted uncomfortably, his face tight. Like I got hit by a freight skiff. Twice. That's an improvement, Chirsk replied dryly. You were much worse when you arrived. Your blood pressure is back to safe levels, but your pain receptors are still highly active. Would you like an analgesic this time? Charlie hesitated, pressing his lips into a thin line. Nah, I'm good. Chirsk paused, turning to fix him with a pointed stare. You are good in the same way a crashing ship is just a little off course. This is not the time for bravado. Charlie attempted a shrug but winced instead, the movement pulling at his injured arm. I'm serious. I'll manage. Just want to get out of here and back on my feet. You're not leaving, Chirsk replied firmly, returning to the scanner. Your body has lost too much blood, and your muscular injury is severe. Moving around prematurely will only reopen the wound and cause internal damage. Charlie groaned, tilting his head back in frustration. How long are we talking? Be honest. At least a week before you can even think about light activity, Chirsk said. Full recovery will take 3 to 4 weeks. This isn't negotiable. A week? You're killing me here, Doc. No, I'm saving your life, Chirsk snapped. They gestured toward the IV bag. Right now, this synthetic hemoglobin is compensating for what your body cannot produce fast enough. Without rest and proper care, it won't matter how stubborn you are. Your heart, lungs, and brain all rely on oxygen transport, until your natural red blood cells replenish themselves. You'll be operating at a fraction of your capacity. Charlie muttered something inaudible but didn't argue further. Chirsk made a note on the console, scheduling a follow-up plasma infusion and nutrient boost for later in the day. The next morning, Chirsk began addressing the deeper aspects of Charlie's injuries. They started by scanning the wound to assess the progress of the biogel. The gel had adhered well, forming a protective barrier that kept contaminants out while promoting superficial tissue regeneration. However, the internal muscle damage presented a more significant challenge. Your superficial tissue is healing as expected, Chirsk explained, studying the scans. But the muscle fibers are repairing more slowly. We'll need to use a microsuture device to align the fibers properly and ensure they regenerate in the correct orientation. Sounds fancy, Charlie said, watching as Chirsk prepared the sleek handheld tool. The device emitted a soft hum, its tip glowing faintly. How bad's it gonna hurt? More than you'll admit, I'm sure, Chirsk said flatly, positioning the tool over the wound. The microsutures are necessary to prevent long-term weakness or scarring, but they can be uncomfortable. I'll apply a localized anesthetic. Charlie's jaw tightened as Chirsk sprayed a cool anesthetic over his arm. The numbing agent dulled the immediate sensation, but when the microsuture device activated, weaving biodegradable filaments into his torn muscle fibers, his body tensed involuntarily. His free hand gripped the edge of the biobe as his breathing quickened. I can tell this isn't painless, Chirsk said, glancing up briefly. Are you certain you don't want additional pain relief? Charlie exhaled sharply through his nose, his face pale but determined. I'm fine. Just finish it. Chirsk didn't press the issue, focusing on completing the procedure. By the time they finished, the wound looked markedly better. The torn edges of muscle were neatly aligned, and the biogel was reapplied to seal the sutures. Done, Chirsk said, setting the tool aside. You'll feel soreness for the next few days, but this should significantly improve your healing trajectory. Charlie let out a long breath, his body visibly relaxing. Thanks, Doc. You really know your stuff. I do, Chirsk said, their tone matter-of-fact. Which is why I'm telling you this: you are not to use that arm for any reason. No lifting, no pulling, no stretching. Understood. Yeah, Charlie said with a faint grin. I'll be good. You're lying, Chirsk replied without missing a beat. But if you disregard my instructions, you'll only hurt yourself further. Over the next several days, Chirsk monitored Charlie's progress closely. The synthetic hemoglobin infusions were gradually reduced as his natural red blood cell count began to recover. His vitals stabilized and his body temperature normalized, signaling that the immediate crisis had passed. However, the road to recovery was far from over. On the 5th day, Chirsk introduced the first phase of physical therapy. They escorted Charlie to a rehabilitation chamber equipped with a gravity-adjustable treadmill and resistance bands. Charlie looked skeptical as Chirsk activated the treadmill, setting the gravity to half the ship's normal level. Walking, Charlie said, raising an eyebrow. That's it. For now, Chirsk replied. Your muscles need to relearn proper movement patterns without strain. We'll increase intensity gradually. Charlie stepped onto the treadmill, his movements stiff and awkward at first. Chirsk adjusted the settings, providing verbal feedback as they monitored his form. Keep your posture straight. Don't overcompensate with your uninjured arm. I feel like a newborn calf, Charlie grumbled. Good, Chirsk said dryly. That means you're doing it correctly. As the sessions continued, Charlie began to regain strength and confidence in his movements. Chirsk added light resistance exercises to rebuild muscle strength, carefully monitoring for signs of overexertion. By the end of the 2nd week, Charlie was able to lift his arm slightly without discomfort, a small but significant victory. Despite his initial impatience, Charlie grudgingly admitted that Chirsk's methods were working. The medtech's meticulous care and insistence on rest had paid off, allowing Charlie to make steady progress toward recovery. "You know," Charlie said one day as they finished a therapy session, "you're not so bad, Doc." Chirsk arched an eyebrow. "I'll take that as high praise." As Charlie flexed his arm, testing its range of motion, he added with a grin, "But you better believe I'll be back in action sooner than you think." Chirsk sighed, shaking their head. "Of that, I have no doubt." By the third week of recovery, Charlie's arm had made substantial progress, but there were still challenges to overcome. His range of motion had improved, and the superficial tissue was nearly healed, thanks to a combination of biogel reapplications and careful dressing changes. However, Chirsk remained insistent that full strength and functionality required adherence to the rehabilitation plan. Charlie sat in the rehabilitation chamber, his injured arm wrapped in a supportive sleeve equipped with sensors to monitor muscle activity. Chirsk stood nearby, adjusting the parameters of the resistance device they'd prepared for the day's session. "We're increasing resistance by 15%, Chirsk said, not looking up from the tablet in their hand. "This should push your muscles enough to encourage regrowth while avoiding strain." 15%, Charlie raised an eyebrow, flexing his arm experimentally. "You trying to break me, Doc?" "You're not that fragile," Chirsk replied. "But you're also not fully healed. Don't overestimate yourself." Charlie rolled his eyes but took hold of the resistance band Chirsk handed him. As he began the prescribed motions, slow, controlled pulls against the band, he could feel the dull ache in his muscles, a reminder of how far he still had to go. "You're compensating," Chirsk observed sharply, stepping closer. "You're using your shoulder to take over the movement. Isolate the muscle. Focus." Charlie exhaled through his nose, annoyed but compliant. He adjusted his posture and concentrated on using only his recovering arm. After a few repetitions, sweat began to bead on his forehead. "Burns like hell," he muttered. "That's normal," Chirsk said. "But if you feel sharp pain, stop immediately." Charlie grunted in acknowledgement, continuing the exercise. When the session ended, his arm felt like jelly, but the sensors on the sleeve reported improvement in muscle activation and coordination. The following day, Chirsk introduced Charlie to a new piece of equipment, a neural feedback glove designed to enhance fine motor control. The glove was wired with microsensors that connected to a holographic interface, displaying Charlie's movements in real time. "Today we're focusing on precision," Chirsk explained. "You'll guide the holographic markers into their targets using your injured arm. Accuracy is the goal." Charlie slipped on the glove, watching as the holographic markers floated into view. When he moved his fingers, the glove transmitted the motion to the display, creating a trail of light as he directed the markers. "This doesn't look so bad," Charlie said, tentatively moving the first marker toward its target. As soon as it touched the edge of the target, the holographic display buzzed red, and Chirsk's voice chimed in. "You overshot. Try again, slower this time." Charlie frowned, focusing harder. His movements were jerky at first, a result of weakened coordination and lingering muscle stiffness. It took several attempts before he successfully guided the marker into its target without error. By the end of the session, his arm throbbed from the effort, but the improvement in his control was undeniable. "Not bad," Chirsk said as they removed the glove from Charlie's hand. "But you'll need more sessions before your coordination returns to pre-injury levels." Charlie flexed his fingers experimentally, feeling a mix of satisfaction and frustration. "You're a tough coach, Doc." "I have to be," Chirsk replied. "You'd get yourself injured again without proper oversight." Midway through the week, Chirsk escalated Charlie's therapy to include endurance training. They set up a modified treadmill in the chamber, programming it to simulate various gravitational pulls. "This will help strengthen your cardiovascular system while forcing your arm to adapt to dynamic conditions," Chirsk said, adjusting the settings. "You'll use your injured arm for balance throughout." Charlie stepped onto the treadmill, gripping the support handles with both arms. As the treadmill started, the gravity shifted to simulate the uneven pull of a low-gravity moon. Charlie stumbled slightly but quickly adjusted his stance. Keep your posture aligned, Chirsk instructed. And don't grip too tightly with your uninjured arm. The goal is symmetry. Charlie muttered under his breath but complied, focusing on maintaining his balance as the treadmill's settings fluctuated. Sweat dripped down his face as the simulation grew more complex, introducing sudden changes in speed and incline. By the end of the session, he was exhausted but felt a small surge of pride. Not bad for someone who was stuck in a recliner 2 weeks ago, huh? You've made progress, Chirsk admitted. But don't let your ego outpace your body's capabilities. You're not finished yet. At the end of the 3rd week, Chirsk conducted a comprehensive evaluation of Charlie's progress. They used a medical scanner to assess the alignment of the repaired muscle fibers and the strength of the connective tissue. The results were encouraging. Charlie's arm was nearing full strength, with no signs of inflammation or improper healing. You're ready for the final phase of recovery, Chirsk announced, handing Charlie a weighted bar. This is for dynamic exercises. You'll practice compound movements to restore functional strength. Charlie raised the bar experimentally, testing its weight. About time. What am I doing with this? Lateral raises, presses, and rotational movements, Chirsk replied. Start slowly. I'll monitor your form. Charlie followed the instructions, moving the bar through a series of prescribed motions. He could feel the strain in his arm but pushed through it, determined to prove he was ready to return to full activity. When the session ended, Chirsk nodded approvingly. You've come a long way, but remember, recovery doesn't stop here. You'll need to continue these exercises daily to maintain your progress. Got it, Charlie said with a grin. Thanks, Doc. You've been a real lifesaver. It's my job, Chirsk replied, their tone softening slightly. But you've made it unnecessarily difficult at times. Charlie laughed, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah, I'm not the easiest patient, but I think we make a good team. Chirsk's fur rippled in amusement. Perhaps. Just don't make me regret clearing you for light duty. As Charlie left the chamber, he felt a renewed sense of confidence. The journey had been grueling, but he was finally starting to feel like himself again. For the first time since his injury, he felt ready to face the challenges ahead. By the 4th week, Charlie's progress had entered the final stages of recovery, but the process was far from over. His arm had regained significant strength, and the tissue regeneration was nearly complete. Yet Chirsk remained adamant that his functional recovery required careful conditioning to avoid long-term complications. You've reached the point where you could resume some duties, Chirsk said, reviewing the latest scan results. But that does not mean you're at full capacity. Today's focus will be on endurance and multitasking to simulate real-world scenarios. Charlie raised an eyebrow as Chirsk gestured toward the far end of the rehabilitation chamber. A holographic environment had been activated, displaying a simulated spacecraft interior. The scene was complete with flickering lights, distant alarms, and floating debris. You built me an obstacle course, Charlie asked, smirking. Didn't know you cared so much. This is a controlled training environment, Chirsk corrected. Your task is to navigate the course while maintaining the stability of the load in your injured arm. The holographic system will track your performance. What's the load? Charlie asked warily. Chirsk handed him a weighted simulation of a plasma containment core, its bright casing marked with warnings. You'll carry this through the course. If your movements are too abrupt or unsteady, the simulation will register a breach. Charlie took the device, testing its weight. It wasn't particularly heavy, but the awkward shape in his recovering arm made balancing it a challenge. Great. If I mess up, the fake ship blows up. It's a hologram, Chirsk replied. The only thing at risk is your pride. Charlie rolled his eyes but stepped into the simulated environment. The first section of the course was straightforward, requiring him to navigate narrow corridors while keeping the core steady. His movements were cautious, his arm straining slightly with each turn. Keep your posture aligned, Chirsk's voice echoed from the observation console. You're favoring your uninjured side again. Charlie adjusted his stance, gritting his teeth as the weight pressed against his recovering muscles. The course grew more complex, introducing simulated decompression blasts that jolted the environment. At one point, Charlie stumbled, the core wobbling precariously in his grip. "Easy," Chirsk said. "Regain control before moving forward." Charlie steadied the device, his breathing heavy as he continued. The final stretch required him to climb a ladder while balancing the core, a task that left his arm trembling by the time he reached the top. The simulation ended with a chime, and the holographic environment dissolved. Chirsk approached, holding a tablet displaying Charlie's performance metrics. "You completed the course in acceptable time," Chirsk said, though their tone was neutral. "But your movement efficiency was suboptimal, and your grip stability requires improvement." Charlie sank onto a nearby bench, wiping sweat from his brow. "I thought I did pretty well, considering I'm carrying half an engine on one arm." "You did well enough," Chirsk admitted. "But there's room for improvement. We'll run the simulation again tomorrow." Charlie groaned. "Can't wait." The following days were filled with increasingly demanding exercises. Chirsk introduced Charlie to dynamic tasks that tested his reflexes and coordination. One exercise involved catching weighted spheres launched from various angles, forcing him to rely on quick reactions and controlled strength. "Don't overreach," Chirsk instructed as Charlie fumbled one of the spheres. "Keep your movements precise." "I'm trying," Charlie muttered, his frustration evident. "You're compensating for your recovery by rushing," Chirsk observed. "This is about rebuilding neural pathways as much as muscle strength. Patience is essential." Charlie sighed but adjusted his approach, focusing on controlled motions. By the end of the session, he had caught more spheres than he dropped a small but meaningful victory. On the final day of the 4th week, Chirsk conducted a comprehensive evaluation. They used a series of advanced diagnostics to assess the structural integrity of Charlie's repaired muscles and the alignment of his joints. The scans confirmed what Chirsk had suspected: Charlie's recovery was nearly complete. "You've reached a significant milestone," Chirsk said, setting down the scanner. "Your arm is functional and stable. You're cleared for full activity with minor restrictions." Finally, Charlie said, grinning as he flexed his arm. "I was starting to think I'd never get out of here." "Don't misunderstand," Chirsk cautioned. "You're not invincible. Overexertion could still cause setbacks. Continue your exercises daily and report any discomfort immediately." Charlie nodded, his grin undimmed. "Got it. Thanks for everything, Doc. I owe you one." Chirsk arched an eyebrow. "You owe me nothing. But if you're truly grateful, refrain from injuring yourself again." "No promises," Charlie said with a wink, heading for the door. As Chirsk watched him leave, they felt a rare sense of satisfaction. Charlie's recovery had been arduous, but his resilience and determination had prevailed. Humans, for all their reckless tendencies, possessed a remarkable ability to endure and thrive against the odds.